Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's 3 o'clock. We'll just give it another 60 seconds or so to let everybody finish brewing their cup of tea and joining before we kick off. Okay, it's 1 minute past, so let's get going, shall we? Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for taking time out of your busy diaries this afternoon, or morning, or evening, wherever you might be located. And my name's Mike Fry. I am the Security and Cloud Business Unit Director at Logicalis, and I've been in this space for around 20 years. Today's webinar is all around preparing for NIS2. And NIS2 has been on a horizon now for quite some time, but it's only really recently, probably earlier this year, where we started seeing organisations see NIS2 coming hurtling at them with that October deadline, and now started to think about what they need to do to put things in place and what their gaps are, where do they need to get to. And we're seeing these questions come through from customers and organisations that we speak to today, such as, are we in scope for NIS2 now? What's changed between NIS1 and NIS2? What about if I'm in the UK? Does it apply to me? And if it does apply to me, where do I start? And that's why we put this webinar together, to really answer those questions, set that top level of information out, and help show you where we can help organisations understand where they are today and where they need to get to. If you can flip on to the next slide, please, Callum, we'll run through the agenda. So we're going to go through what the timeline has been from NIS1 to where we are now and what the future looks like. And we'll look at some of the key requirements and obligations inside NIS2 from a reporting perspective, and also some of the challenges that might pose to some organisations. We'll look at what's changed, what organisations are now in scope, depending on what sector they work in, and depending on what size they are, because that's also changed now. And we'll also show you our approach to helping organisations understand where they are today from a NIS2 perspective, where their gaps are, and what they need to do next. Now, Logicalis, we have a GRC team with experts, some of who are on this call today, to help organisations. But we also work with many vendors in various spaces of the technology stack. And all the vendors, of course, have got their own view on how their solutions of technology help you from a NIS2 perspective. But they're always going to be through a lens of the solutions and the capabilities which that vendor has. So they have their place, but really this is much broader than just technology. It encompasses people and processes as well. So our take on this is very much from a vendor agnostic, independent perspective to cover all of those three areas. So I hope the next 30, 45 minutes are very useful to you. If you've got any questions, put them in the Q&A section, and when we get to the relevant part at the end, we'll run through those questions. And if you do think that a discovery workshop and a potential gap analysis will help you, scan the QR code, which is on most of those slides. You can register your details and one of the team will be in touch. So without further ado, let me hand over to two of our resident experts, Callum and Andy, to introduce themselves. Callum.
Thanks for that, Mike. Hi, my name's Callum Campbell. I'm Senior Security Advisory Specialist at Logicalis. I sit mainly within the GRC space, but with a technical background. Spent a lot of time working in critical national infrastructure in both transportation and manufacturing, and I have delivered against the NIS 2018 framework in multiple occasions. Andy.
Thank you, Callum. Andy Cavender. I'm an enterprise architect at Logicalis. So like Callum, I work within the security advisory team at Logicalis. I tend to look at things more from a technology focus within risk and compliance, and working with customers to look at strategy and roadmap and developing those out so that they have a view as to how these will fit in to their compliance journey across multiple frameworks. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Andy. So let's have a little look at the Network and Information System version 2 timeline. How did we get here? So it started with NIS 2018 directive, which came about in 2016. It was specifically focused mainly around cyber physical systems, operational technology, manufacturing, gas, oil, energy, healthcare. Fast forward to 2019, the EU decided we wanted to create a cyber shield across the EU. NIS2 directive, as it's become, wasn't one piece of legislation that they wanted driven across the EU, but it was the main focus. So the developments from NIS 2018 into NIS2 and how they wanted to shape that and look, they looked at the areas where cybersecurity maybe wasn't so mature. The industry is very good at putting in point solutions, good technology, but perhaps there's pieces around risk assessment, business continuity, supply chain security. These are aspects that Andy will touch on later, but they really wanted to focus in on them. So as we fast forward through to 2022, the EU Parliament then votes to adopt NIS2 as a directive. It's then approved, and in December 2022, it's passed down to the member states to turn into legislation. January 2023 officially comes into force, and by that it is the change from directive to legislation. So the individual member states across the EU have had from January 2023 through to 17th of October 2024, which is the critical date, to turn that directive into legislation for each individual member state. So when we cross over to the 18th of October 2024, the original 2018 directive will be repealed. But that's not to say that it's to be forgotten about, because certainly within critical national infrastructure, they're augmenting the two directives. These controls are still relevant today. So what's new? What's changed? So originally in the NIS 2018 directive, we had things, they were called operators of essential services. We've now separated these out into essential entities and important entities. And it's a really important distinction. So in the original directive with healthcare, energy, transport, drinking water, digital infrastructure, as I'd already discussed, we've added in the essential entities: space, wastewater, public or government administration, ICT service management, so business to business, and financial and market infrastructure and banking, which, as you can see, we've highlighted with DORA, the Digital Operation Resilience Act. So the financial sector is actually taking on two very large pieces of legislation at the same time that they have to comply with both of them. So under the important entities, they've added waste management, manufacturing, research, food production and distribution, manufacture, production and distribution of chemicals, and postal services. We'll discuss a little bit about what the main differences between essential and important entities are in a little bit. So reporting. The EU has implemented strict reporting obligations and timelines in respect to cyber incidents across the EU. So as I discussed, their idea is to create a cyber shield across the EU. They identified that the main threat to the European Union and to businesses is supply chain. Supply chain security is critical to them. So the idea behind the reporting obligations is that if you report, you become aware of your incident within 24 hours, and you're going to report that. Within 72 hours, you have full notification and an initial assessment of that incident. And within 1 month, a final report of the incident. So when you tie this back to the supply chain, it means that specific sectors can become aware very quickly of any form of threat across that sector. If you're using specific systems, stacked software, you can become aware of that across the entirety of the EU. So it's critical, and this is why it's very, very important. And they're making a large point around the reporting obligations and timelines within the EU. So the compliance challenges. The original NIS 2018 directive didn't really have any teeth about it. You didn't get fined if you didn't comply with it. Maybe if you were in the energy industry, like in the UK, maybe it's Ofgem as your regulator for energy, would look at your licensing if you weren't compliant, but you certainly weren't fined. This has now changed. They've given it some teeth. So for essential entities, €10 million, or 2% of your entity's global turnover, whichever amount is higher, could potentially be the fine for non-compliance against the directive. For important entities, €7 million, or 1.4% of the entity's global turnover, again, whichever is higher. There are some other interesting aspects that we should note here. The C-suite, CISOs, board members will be held personally liable and accountable. So they take on the responsibility and the accountability if the organisation doesn't follow the directive. What do we really mean by that? It means that our risks have to be articulated in an appropriate manner to the appropriate board. We have to make sure that everybody understands the risks are and what are we going to do about those risks. I think the last thing I really want to touch on here is the requirement to declare the scope of your organisation and register with your member state. As an example, the Irish NCSE have stipulated that on the 17th of October or after, if you are in scope for NIS2, you must register with them. So organisational sizing. What defines if you're in scope or not? It's actually a little bit of a complex subject, but we try to distill this down. We split this into essential and important entities against organisational size, annual turnover, and your balance sheet. So for essential entities, if one of these is true, then you're in scope. So if you are in the essential entity bracket and you have more than 250 employees, you need to comply. If you have less than 250 employees, but you have more than €50 million of annual turnover, you need to comply. Or if your balance sheet is over €43 million, you need to comply. For important entities, if you're between 10 and 250 employees, again, you must comply. Annual turnover between 10 to €50 million, and the balance sheet between 10 and €43 million. Over to Andy. Andy's going to discuss some technical aspects around the NIS2 directive.
Thank you, Callum. So from what we're seeing on screen, it's really showing the high-level areas of technical objectives from the NIS2 directive. There are a lot of detail within each of them, but we'll cover them at a high level just to give a view as to what they might be and how they apply. So first one around risk assessment and security policies. As Callum mentioned, one of the key areas that the EU is trying to enforce is risk management. So this is around assessing risk, understanding risk, and being able to prioritize it. This can be based on things like the foundation of using something like ISO 27001 as an information security management system, which will enforce good practice and policies across that. I think one of the other areas, and Callum mentioned it going through it, is it's not about just risk assessments within IT. This is being able to articulate and have that level up to the board level so that they understand, can prioritize and act on risks that are being enacted as part of the NIS2 directive. So those that surface up through an organization, and this may be not just internal risks, and one of the points you can see at the bottom of his supply chain is about managing third-party risk. So understanding where your risks are across the organization and being able to surface those. Asset management, this really is around what are the assets within there. If you're going to do a risk assessment and risk management, you need to understand what your assets are. This could be systems, it could be data, it could be people, it could be physical assets. What a part of this is understanding what those are, assessing risks, so doing things like vulnerability assessments against them, and then being able to manage those risks. But the key part of asset management is you can't do any of that unless you actually understand where your assets are and be able to prioritize them against your critical services. So understanding which assets actually support the critical services of an organization, and that again can be assets that are both internal and external, so those that are provided by external parties. Incident and crisis management. Well, again, that's one of the key areas that the EU is trying to get visibility on, is being able to improve organizational resilience. So being able to improve what they can do within an incident. So a lot of the legislation starts to look at measures that can help address cybersecurity and improve it and improve hygiene, but also being able to detect and respond to an incident is particularly important. You've seen from what Callum showed a few slides ago, the reporting requirements on this, which are quite strict. You've got to identify initially within 24 hours. So that means you've got to be able to detect. So validate where something's coming in, whether that be anomalous behavior, whether that be a data breach, whatever that might be able to understand it and actually understand that it's happened and therefore follow the reporting chain. And that leads into things like incident response, crisis management, being able to react to that incident. Once you know about it, you're following that process, the communication chain, both within local member states. So as Callum mentioned, essential and important entities have to register, but they also then have to report usually up to their local national cybersecurity agency. So having that in place, what the communication is, internal and external, and then running exercise to validate that this is in place. That not only if you've got a written process, but you know how to follow it, you know the people that are involved, and you know the processes that will be required as part of that. Cryptography and encryption. This is about understanding how you actually protect data, wherever that data lives. So back to part of the asset management piece is understanding where your data is within an environment. And then the cryptography and encryption part of it is knowing how you're securing that. So that might be in transit across the network, it might be where it's stored, it may be stored internally again or externally. So what are your suppliers doing if they're storing your information? Also, how do you safeguard that? So do you put other controls around this to actually enforce that sort of data security part of it? Procurement and development security. This is sort of twofold. The first part, procuring systems. So when you're looking at purchasing new or refreshing existing ones, embedding security within that. So understanding what the security posture of the system you have, whether it has ongoing security updates, what's the life cycle of it, and then obviously things that are being either developed for you or you're developing yourself. So, code validation, application testing, application penetration testing, all within that development life cycle to ensure that, again, security is embedded as part of the process. Data access management, again, comes back to the asset piece. You first need to understand where is your data, and then where is it, who's using it, how are they accessing it, how are you controlling access to that. Cybersecurity training and hygiene, both from a user perspective, i.e. educating people in terms of what does good cyber hygiene look like, so basic endpoint protection, web security, web filtering, as well as also ensuring that people are aware of what NIS2 as a requirement is. And again, this filters through to taking it right up to that management board level so that the management board is aware of the requirements of NIS2 and their role within it, so that they have a fundamental role to ensure that the organization is fulfilling its needs as part of the NIS2 directive, and that they are seeing risks being highlighted to them and they're taking the appropriate action and ensuring that whatever remediation or mitigation is put in place for those risks is actually happening. And that should be a continual process. Business continuity, again, one of the key aspects that the EU are trying to force, a little bit part of the incident and crisis management piece, ensuring that organizations can continue to operate if they have a cyber incident, and that, again, this is tested and familiarity with it, so such that a business can continue if they have an incident, whether that be something like ransomware or a loss of a facility. So backups, ransomware protection, endpoint security around that. Multi-factor authentication, or actually more than multi-factor authentication, this is much more around how you engage around identity management. So how do you manage the identities within your organization? How do you secure them? How do you process them? So how movers, leaves, changes, etc. How do you give people the right level of access into the environment? Again, both internal and external. And this feeds into things like zero trust strategy. So ensuring that as part of that, you have a whole access platform that you know how people are being granted access. And then last but not least is the supply chain security. So this is very much around assessing your supply chain, knowing who you have within your supply chain, what roles they have, what the criticality of those suppliers are within that. That might be IT, it might be non-IT, what data they hold of your organization. So if there's a compromise within the supply chain, even if they're not a direct IT supplier to you, but they hold organizational information, which could effectively give a third party or a malicious actor additional information that would allow them to compromise or act upon that. And this may be contractual, and I think one of the points we'll cover off later is what does that mean if we're not in scope for NIS2 but we're in the supply chain. I think what we're seeing as part of the requirements developed from directive into legislation is there being a much more focus on this and some guidance around how organizations do this within their supply chain. And I think one of the key elements we're seeing is start to enforce that through contractual requirements. So you might not be in scope of NIS2, but it's likely that some of those requirements, if not all, will flow through to you if you're supplying into organizations that are within scope of NIS2, especially those that are in the essential category for NIS2. Thank you. Next slide, please. So we talk about the NIS2 directive, and as Callum says, it's built up over a period of time. And I think what we're trying to get through with this slide is it's not just one thing, or it doesn't map onto one particular framework. Organizations may have a number of these. I won't go through every one of them on the list here, but you'll see that there is a number of different standards that fit into this. So we mentioned ISO 27001 in terms of an information security management standard. That certainly helps within compliance towards NIS2, but it doesn't give you full coverage. There are also things like IC 62443, which sits into the operational technology space, and then things like the CIS critical security controls or the NIST cybersecurity framework. All of these elements are good basic cyber hygiene controls and will all have a foundation in the technical controls that will be leveraged for NIS2, but not any of them fully covers NIS2 end to end. So having any of them or working towards them as frameworks or standards will definitely help your compliance towards it, but it won't be I've got this and therefore it covers it. I think probably one thing to point out, and probably aligns to a number of things like ISO 27001, is NIS2 is organization wide. So for people like in the manufacturing areas, it will cover both IT and OT systems. So operational technology systems would still need to be covered, part of the directive that NIS2 determines and the controls that it would need to be enacted upon. So how can we help? So this is just a sample of an output from a gap analysis. So one of the key things we start to do with customers is to start to understand how they are, what is their current as-is state around maturity towards compliance with NIS2. Callum has already mentioned the first part of that is really understanding the scope and where an organization fits within the NIS2 scope. So does it fit into essential or important? And there are a number of factors that weigh on that. It's both the sector you operate in and the size of the organization, and it does vary, and it has some specific areas that are called out within the directive. So although we gave you a very high level view of the sectors that are there, it needs to be delved into much more in detail for that, and also ensuring that it's not maybe just your core business that's in scope. If you've got a subsidiary that fits into it, as Callum pointed out earlier, the penalties are actually against the global turnover of the organisation. So although it might be a small part of the organisation that's actually in scope, the penalty is against the overall business. So, if there are specific subsidiaries or business units, they may be specifically in scope, but the rest of the business isn't. So we then start to do this gap analysis, and as we can show on the screen, depending on the organization, where they sit, whether they're essential or important, what the type of environment they're operating in, can leverage where they need to get to and how quickly they need to get there. So, as a typical thing, we would do this assessment, and the results here are, organizations are better in some places than others. There are bigger gaps in places than others, and we would then work through the prioritized order of this to create a roadmap and a timeline to try to achieve a maturity within typically 12 to 18 months. And that's the sort of timeline we're starting to see to come through for overall compliance for the NIS2 directive. Next one, please. Back to you, Mike.
Great, thank you, Andy. Thank you, Callum. Checking the Q&A panel, there are no questions yet, which should mean we've done a good job of answering the basic fundamentals. But we're talking to customers all the time about this, and we do get lots of questions, and we get feedback from customers, and we often debate these internally. So we thought it'd be really useful for everybody on the call to, I guess, listen in on those kind of conversations that we have when we get those questions from customers. And one of the key ones that we get, particularly from UK-based customers, is, well, this hasn't come to the UK yet. Why can't I just wait until it does? Callum, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's an interesting question. So the answer to that is really based around the UK leaving the EU. So we have in the UK a lot of legislation that has been separated from the EU, and there's a massive backlog behind that. So that's it. That's the fundamental driver behind that. What I can say is within the UK, the NCSE has the NIS-CAF, the Cyber Assessment Framework, which is measured against the NIS 2018 regulations that we have currently for critical national infrastructure. They recently released version 3.2, I believe it was in April. Within version 3.2, we've seen a number of changes across that. Some of them are geared towards bringing cyber essentials into the NIS-CAF. But it was clear that some of the additional changes was to complement what you would see within the NIS version 2 in the EU. So we can definitely see some form of alignment there. There's no doubt about that. And I think you could wait, but I think it would also be beneficial to understand where you are just now. How do you align yourself with what's coming in the future? And I think that it's really important to consider that, or certainly start that analysis, because if you have up or downstream suppliers or supplied to within the EU, it is likely that you will have an obligation to comply with the directive. So that could be that the supply chain questionnaire comes from a supplier and says, are you compliant with X, Y, and Z, or we need to vet you? Certainly, I know that I'm aware of customers both ways with Logicalis and, as I say, down and upstream, who are rationalizing and consolidating suppliers based on their security posture. So I wouldn't wait. I would definitely, if I'm in the UK, I would be analysing this, looking at how I do business, where I do business, understanding if I'm in a supply chain and being proactive around that.
Yeah, I think these things are always better when you're preparing in advance, not waiting until the last minute. And you're right, as a supplier, as part of the supply chain to organisations that are based in the EU and the UK, we, in the last 3 or 4 months, certainly seen an uptick now in the requests that we get from information as part of that supply chain process.
Absolutely.
And a slight variation to that question we often get as well is, will this be coming to the UK and when? And maybe there's a slightly differently nuanced answer to that. What do you think, Andy?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And the answer to that has probably changed in the last couple of weeks with the change of government in the UK. And why I say that is the previous government had announced pretty much what Callum had said. They'd announced in 2023 that the UK would be working towards alignment with European directives. It doesn't mean that we'd take everything on board within the UK, but that they would try and have a similar level. The likelihood was that it was going to be through an update of the existing NIS directive, which was still in place in the UK because it had been legislatively brought into the UK when we were part of the EU. And the timeline that was announced at the start, I think it was the previous Parliament, was that that would go through the parliamentary process, obviously time permitting, but the expectation was that that would be worked on through 2024 with the expectation that it would come into the UK in 2025. And we could see that through a number of things that were happening within the UK. As Callum mentioned, the UK NCSC had updated the cyber assessment framework to version 3.2 earlier this year, and that very much aligned to the key messages that were coming from the NIS2 directive, and actually went a little bit further and actually started to define some of the ways you would comply or be non-compliant against it. So they were quite specific in what that meant in terms of it, but in terms of broad approach, it saw that. They'd also created some draft documents at the start of the year that were looking around code of conduct for board level operating processes to ensure that they again understood the risks around cyber security and had processes in place to do that and what was expected for them to be able to operate. What's not clear, and we might get more clarity tomorrow when I think the state opening of Parliament happens for the UK following the change of government, but there might be some discussion in terms of what the cybersecurity bills mean and whether there's any timeline associated with them. I think it will still happen. You see around both obviously the EU are focused on it. They've created a number of acts. I know there's been some information in the press that the Keir Starmer government will likely to start doing process around AI. So AI bills and legislation will start to come out. I would expect that will follow either as part of the same parliament or shortly after that they'll start enacting cybersecurity. But we can see that as a global piece, both in the EU, the US, from what they're doing in the federal government, the likes of Australia are all starting to create cybersecurity legislation to basically protect the important entities. So essentially important, but those that are critical to organizations and to states to actually be able to operate.
Yeah, it's highly likely to be coming in some shape or form. It's just a bit of a watch this space at the moment, isn't it?
It is.
Thank you, Andy. We have a question in the Q&A, one for Callum and Andy. So the question is, what maturity level does NIS2 expect organisations to have achieved from a compliance standpoint as essential and important entities? Is it defined enough, or do organisations need to aim for a higher level?
I can take part of that question, I think. So, so I think that the definition behind that in terms of maturity level. So we typically use capability, maturity model, and integration, which has been around for decades. It's widely accepted. In terms of IT, I haven't seen anything specific. What I can definitively say, though, in terms of operational technology, there's an expectation, and this expectation will drive across all the member states, that IEC or ISA 62443 would be implemented, and it is clearly defined within that set of standards what type of organisation has to achieve what security level and what maturity level. So as an example of that, if you have a nuclear power plant, your security and maturity level would be 5. So it would be the highest maturity level that you could achieve. If you manufacture paper clips, it's likely to be maturity level 2. And the security controls that are based around the maturity and security level within 62443 obviously vary in size and scope. So it's probably the most comprehensive and stringent cybersecurity standard I've come across, and the higher up the level you go, the higher that is. It's all based on human risk, human safety. It's the safety of the human ultimately within that environment or outside that environment, how it can transfer into the public, and that's what drives those security levels. But in terms of the IT side of it, I haven't seen anything specifically as yet. Maybe Andrew has.
Yeah, so maybe just to add to that, I think, as mentioned earlier, what we're seeing, and I think looking back about a month ago, there's only 3 countries in the EU that have actually turned this into legislation. There's a number that are in draft, and then a number that have announced they are, such as Ireland, they're about to announce drafts. But what we've seen from those that have actually either got their drafts published or have turned this into legislation is they're starting to leverage a number of the different frameworks. So ISO 27001 is one that they're talking about. The CIS critical security controls, NIST cybersecurity framework, IEC 62443, as Callum has mentioned. These are the things that they're basing these assessments on. And in terms of the maturity between essential and important, it's the same. There doesn't seem to be at the moment any differentiation in that. What the differentiation is how you show compliance and potentially the timeline to compliance. So from the ones that have published the legislation, we're seeing that they're expecting, as you'd probably predict, that essential entities have a shorter timeline to compliance. Those that are important have a slightly longer one, and essential will become an audited function via either the National Cybersecurity Agency or a third party that is allowed to do that, whereas important is more of a self-assessment, but you'll be audited obviously if you have a cybersecurity incident or multiple cybersecurity incidents. So I think if you are aligning to any of those frameworks or have an ambition, I think then that certainly helps in terms of the level of compliance and maturity that's expected within there. I think it's not expected that as of the 17th of October, everyone is suddenly compliant. But what is expected, and Callum touched on it earlier, is that you would be registered and that you then start to show how you are looking to comply with NIS2, whether that be alignment to things like those standards we've mentioned or a different process, and what your expected timeline to do so is. And expect to give updates on this. Again, for essential, it will be mandatory. For those that are important, it would be self-assessment led.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Good comprehensive answer there. Thank you both. You mentioned 27001 there, Andy, and we had a slide earlier which showed the various frameworks that we use to map against the controls within NIS2. But there does seem to be sometimes a premisconception around, if I've just got 27001, does that not just tick all the boxes already, or is there some overlap? And that's quite a common question that we get. Callum, take us through your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So ISO 27001 is interesting where you can define the scope of what you want within your ISMS or your information security management system. It can literally be down to a computer, or it can be the entirety of your enterprise. So I think that's the first thing to understand, is if you're already compliant, what are you compliant with? Is it the entirety of your organization? Have you covered that full scope, or is it a subset? Is it a business unit? You know, where have you made that scope? And if that scope is a business unit within your organization or a section of your organization, and you've excluded something for a specific reason, let's say you do have a manufacturing environment, then you would have to consider that. You'd have to widen that scope. To go further that, so I mentioned a manufacturing environment. ISO 27001 wasn't designed for operational technology environments. IEC 62443 defines what they call a CSMS, so a cybersecurity management system. You can involve these systems. So what I have seen certainly, our organisations are taking the premise of 27001, that management system. It's the management of your security controls, and convolving them with the OT environment, the management of the security controls, as opposed to the implementation of it. In terms of that overlap that we're discussing, we did touch on this earlier on, that there is no one set of standards or frameworks that will assure you compliance with the NIS directive. It's just not possible. There is a convolved mapping system that you can look at. You need to take sections of each of them, put them together, and ultimately what you would end up with is what would look like an ISMS, but beyond the scope of ISO 27001. So it's a really good starting place. If you have that in place already, it's a great place for you to start, and you can build out into the full scope of your enterprise.
Yeah, good, excellent, thank you. You talked about controls there when you talk about 27001, and Andy touched on this earlier, but one of the questions that we get commonly asked is, what are the technical challenges and controls that are required for compliance? Andy, how do you typically answer that?
So I think before looking at the technical controls, it's important, back to what Callum's mentioned, you know, some of the key points that the EU is trying to get across with the NIS2 directive is around risk management. So understanding where your risks are, understanding what the priorities are, and then looking at how to address them. So before jumping into technology, it's about understanding that. So doing a risk assessment, doing a gap analysis, doing a capability assessment. So all of these will start to drive where are the gaps, what's our priority in terms of filling them, what do we currently have in the environment that either we can leverage or extend that can do that, and start to build on that. And from a technical perspective, things like zero trust fit really well into this. You know, a lot of the common points that we touched on earlier of those controls fit very much within a zero trust strategy. And it's actually touched upon within the directive itself. It touches on zero trust and mentions it in terms of ways of compliance. So I think organizations that either have or are developing or adhering to a zero trust strategy across these different areas. You know, we touched on things like identity, we touched on things like data governance, data security, observability in terms of being able to understand that, security controls like SIEM, SOC, etc. So if you're going in that direction or want to start with where would technology start to fit in this, looking at things like zero trust actually fit in well. But it's all about understanding where do your gaps to start with. So doing that gap analysis piece, understanding your current position, and then understanding a strategy to work towards it. And again, this is not an instant we can do everything day one. You know, we'll be compliant by the end of 2024. It's understanding how you prioritize that. And that's very much the EU's approach to this. They're not looking at everyone being compliant day one, but that people understand where to prioritize and where to invest both time, effort, and money to actually drive that level of compliance.
Yeah, where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck, what's going to make the biggest difference.
Yeah, and where your key risks are, you know, filling the biggest holes first, whether that be internally or with your supply chain. And, you know, there will be a lot of focus on supply chain, which will ultimately lead both from the organization that's in scope, but to those that are supplying services to the organization.
Good. Before we come on to the fifth question, we have another question in the Q&A panel. And this one says, people have talked about NIS2, but people are also talking about DORA, if you fall into those industries. Does NIS2 compliance help with DORA compliance? Is there overlap? Callum, you're nodding. What do you think?
Yeah, there is overlap. There are large differences, I would say, between the two, but there is also significant overlap. The main driver behind both directives is the key areas are exactly the same. They've identified that what do we not do well? We don't necessarily perform dynamic risk assessments and articulate those risks well up the way. We don't look at our supply chain particularly well. Again, that's down that risk assessment path. And we don't have particularly well formed or tested business continuity, disaster recovery, incident response plans. These are all critical aspects. That's where the key overlays are. The point solution things I discussed earlier on, we're quite good at. We're great at, you know, getting point solutions in place and so on and so forth. It's bringing them together, understanding what the critical risks are, and how that is holistically applied across your enterprise environment. That's the overlap.
Yeah, good. And as you say, it's going to apply. Both of these might apply to organisations. They've got two heavy-hitting pieces of or directives and legislations coming right at them at pretty much the same time. We talked about this earlier as well, but I think it's really, if we think about the process of a directive and how that is then adopted by the different member states in the EU and how that flows down think it's really important to understand that. And we often get asked the question, well, we trade across multiple EU countries. Are the NIS2 requirements are going to be the same? If I do it in country A, is that me done? Is that tick all the boxes? I can do all 20 odd EU member states, or is there going to be some nuances there? Andy, what are your thoughts on that?
So I think so just to sort of point out where we are, that the NIS2 directive, as Callum went on the timeline earlier, is the EU-wide directive, and then it's down to each member state to turn that into legislation by the 17th of October. Now, the EU have given some flexibility within member states. Well, whilst the overall directive stays the same, they appreciate that each member state might have different needs and different requirements. So they may have some sectors that are more critical to them, so they have the flexibility of changing the designation of essential and important. They also have the flexibility to change things like sizing or add in additional sectors if that's important to them as a member state. And we're all starting to see that through some of the legislation that's coming through, either that is legislation or is in draft at the moment. I think broadly it's the same. A lot of the areas are the same, but you just need to be mindful that it will apply differently if you are actually got trading entities within there. And I think it's important, it's a differentiation between, have you got one entity that's dealing with, trading in several EU countries and EU member states, or have you got actual organizations within each of those member states? So again, back to the point we sort of started on a very early conversations, understanding the scope for NIS2, where you're operational, what type of operations you have, because it may not be the same everywhere. You may have different parts of the organization that operate at different levels, and then looking at what that means broadly. But in a broad sense, yes, the directive will be reasonably common, but there might be localized changes to meet each requirement of each member state.
Have you got any sense on which parameters or controls might be the ones that are variable between those countries? Do we have any view on that yet?
Yeah, we can see from some of the legislation that's come across. So, for example, some of the member states that have say fairly well through that process are starting to include some additional sectors within there, or they're just changing the essential and important piece because it's more relevant to them. So, for example, education has been included in one of the member states that's done it, which is not in the others. We've seen a slight tweak in terms of so the essential and important piece. Also, the member states, if they have localized cybersecurity standards, so for example, Belgium was one of the early member states to actually publish their legislation and get it through into actual legislation. They are aligning it to their localized cybersecurity siphon. So they're starting to align it, but again, based on a standards-based framework. So it is slightly different between member states, but the broad approach of what to tackle, what are the critical areas, very much stays the same across the EU.
Good. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you. We seem to have covered the big five that we get regularly, and also covered those in the Q&A. And I'm conscious of time, and we're heading towards the close now. So, message for the audience, I guess, is next steps. If you feel that any form of kind of gap analysis and an assessment to understand where you're at today, where you need to get to for your target maturity state, and what those big priorities, the big gaps are that you want to prioritize to get you there, then scan the QR code and register your interest, and one of the team will be in touch. I'd also say, even if you just want to chew it over, even if you're still not quite sure as to whether you are in scope, whether you think maybe you operate in the UK, is it worth it? When should I do it? Still register for that, because we'll just do a scoping call to start with and just really understand, the specificities of your organisation. And then we can go through to that workshop piece. We have a tried and tested, proven methodology and a process. So we'll go through the assessments. We'll prepare those gap analyses. We'll sit down with you and present them and go through them together, and then start mapping out what that roadmap to compliance looks like. And that brings us to a close. Once again, thank you everybody for taking time out of your busy diaries. I trust that was useful as a whistle-stop tour of NIS2. You can see it's pretty broad and it's pretty deep. So if you'd like to learn more, register and give us a call. We will follow up by sending you the recording to this session and also the slides as well. and I wish you all the very best for your Tuesday afternoon. Bye for now.
Thank you.